a town shrouded in shadows. The town of Blackmoor lay nestled in a valley, its narrow streets winding like veins through a body long since decayed. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, as if the very land remembered the weight of its own secrets. The buildings, many of them centuries old, stood in solemn silence, their weathered facades bearing the marks of time and neglect. Some had long since crumbled into ruin, their foundations swallowed by creeping ivy and the relentless passage of seasons. Others still stood, their windows dark and their doors sealed, as though the people within had chosen to forget the world beyond their walls. At the heart of the town, the old courthouse loomed, a structure of grim, unadorned stone that had witnessed the passage of generations. Its once proud facade had long since lost its luster, and the rusted iron gates that flanked its entrance bore the scars of countless storms. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of aged paper and candle smoke, the remnants of a time when justice had been served in the hushed corridors of the courtroom. But now, the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the distant echo of a wind that howled through the empty halls like a ghost whispering its unfinished tale. Beyond the courthouse, the town streets stretched in a haphazard sprawl, lined with shuttered shops and abandoned homes that had long since lost their inhabitants. The few who remained were either too old to leave or too afraid of the memories that clung to these streets. The local tavern that clung to these streets, the air was heavy with the scent of aged bandit. Once a place of raucous laughter and lively debate, now stood in quiet disrepair, its windows fogged with the passage of time. The only sound that lingered in the air was the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a crow, its voice sharp and unrelenting. The people of Blackmoor had always been a quiet, insular community, their lives bound by tradition and the weight of history. But something had changed in recent years, something that had crept into the town like a slow-moving tide, leaving behind a sense of unease that no one could quite explain. The old stories had returned, whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors, their warnings of past sins and unspoken betrayals growing louder with each passing day. And in the shadows of the town, a mystery had begun to take shape. The only sound that lingered in the air was the occasional rustle of leaves or the econos. Threads woven from the remnants of a past that refused to be forgotten. The detective with a personal stake, Clara Vane, had spent the better part of her life chasing shadows, but never had she felt the weight of a mystery as deeply as she did now. A former detective with the London Metropolitan Police, she had left the city years ago, seeking solace in the quiet solitude of the countryside. But the past had a way of finding her, and now, as she stood in the heart of Blackmoor, she knew that the town's secrets were far from buried. She had returned to this place not as a tourist, nor as a mere observer of the town's slow decay, but as someone with a personal stake in the mystery that had begun to unfold. Her brother, Thomas, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances nearly a decade ago, his last known whereabouts tied to the very streets that now loomed before her. At the time, the police had ruled it a case of missing persons, but Clara had never accepted that conclusion. She had spent years searching for answers, following the faintest of leads, only to be met with silence and the cold, unyielding walls of bureaucracy. Now, with the recent murders that had shaken the town to its core, she saw a connection that had eluded her before. Clara had always believed that justice was a fragile thing, easily broken by the weight of time and the reluctance of those who feared the truth. She had spent years navigating the murky waters of corruption and cover-ups, learning that the law was not always the final arbiter of justice. It was a lesson that had shaped her, making her both more determined and more wary. She had seen how the powerful could manipulate the system, how the truth could be buried beneath layers of silence and denial. And yet, she had never stopped believing that justice, in some form, could be found. Now, standing in Blackmoor, she felt that belief tested once more. The town had always been a place of quiet tension, its people bound by a history of secrets and unspoken grievances. But something had changed, something that had drawn her back to this place with a sense of urgency she could not ignore. The murders were not random, they were connected, and she was certain that the answers lay buried in the town's past. As she stepped deeper into the streets of Blackmoor, she felt the weight of her own history pressing against her. This was not just a case to solve, it was a reckoning, and she would not leave until the truth was revealed, no matter the cost. The haunting of Blackmoor. The first murder had come without warning. A body discovered in the overgrown lot behind the old mill, its presence a grim reminder of the town's long-forgotten sins. The victim, a local shopkeeper named Harold Wren, had been found in a pool of blood, his throat slashed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike. The police had been quick to label it a robbery gone wrong, but the townspeople knew better. They had seen the same kind of violence before, hidden in the shadows of Blackmoor's past, and now it had returned. The second murder had followed within a week, and the pattern was unmistakable. A schoolteacher, Margaret Hale, had been found in the same manner, her body left in the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. The townspeople whispered of a vengeful spirit, a ghost that had returned to settle old scores. But Clara knew better than to believe in ghosts. There was a method to the killings, a purpose that went beyond mere violence. The victims had no connection to one another, yet they had all been linked in some way to the town's most infamous case, a murder that had been buried in the annals of time, its truth long since forgotten. The townspeople were growing restless. Fear had taken root in the streets, and the once stable community was now a place of suspicion and paranoia. Neighbors no longer spoke to one another, their conversations laced with unspoken fears. The mayor, a man of quiet authority, had called for an emergency meeting, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the unease that gripped the town. The local clergyman had taken to the pulpit, warning of the sins of the past and the judgment that would come if they did not atone for them. But no one could say for certain what had truly happened, and the uncertainty only deepened the town's sense of dread. Clara had seen this kind of fear before, how it could twist minds and turn people against one another. She had walked through the same streets as the victims, had spoken to the same people who now looked at her with wary eyes. And yet, she knew that the killer was not a ghost, nor was there vengeance bound to the past alone. There was something more at play, something that had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, Clara felt the weight of the mystery pressing against her. The killings were not random, and she was certain that the answers lay buried in the town's history. But with each passing day, the fear in Blackmoor grew, and the killer was watching, waiting for the next victim to fall. The vengeful shadow. In the quiet corners of Blackmoor, where the shadows clung to the walls of forgotten buildings and the wind whispered secrets through the cracks in the stone, a figure moved unseen. They were not a stranger to the town, nor were they a face known to the people who now trembled in fear. They had been here before, long before the first body was found in the overgrown lot behind the mill. They had watched as the town's history unfolded, had listened to the hushed conversations of those who had tried to forget, and had waited for the moment when justice would be served in a way the law had failed to deliver. The killer was not a name known to the people of Blackmoor, nor were they a face that had ever appeared in the town's records. They had lived in the periphery of the community, a presence that had never been acknowledged but had always been felt. They had known the town's secrets, had seen the corruption that had festered in its heart, and had waited patiently for the time when the truth would be forced into the light. Now, with the murders that had begun to shake the town to its core, they had finally acted. Their method was precise, their timing impeccable. Each victim had been chosen with care, each death a calculated step toward the fulfillment of a long-held purpose. The killer did not seek to be feared, nor did they revel in the chaos they had unleashed. They were not a man of rage, nor were they driven by the thirst for vengeance in its most brutal form. Instead, they were a seeker of justice, a force that had emerged from the shadows to ensure that those who had once escaped punishment would now face the consequences of their actions. Their knowledge of the town was vast, their understanding of its history unparalleled. They had walked the same streets as, nor were they driven by the thirst for vengeance in its most brutal form. Instead, they were a seeker of justice, a force that had emerged from the shadows to ensure that those who had once escaped punishment would now face the punishment. The victims had spoken to the same people who now looked upon the killer with suspicion and dread. They had seen the way the town had buried its past, how the truth had been hidden beneath layers of silence and denial, and now they were bringing it back to the surface, one life at a time. But the killer was not without their own scars. They had lived with the weight of the town's sins, had carried the burden of the unspoken crimes that had been left to fester. They had not acted out of malice, nor had they sought to destroy the town. They had acted because justice had been denied, because the law had failed to deliver what was owed. And now, with each murder, they were ensuring that the past would not be forgotten again. Unraveling threads. Clara moved through the streets of Blackmoor with the careful precision of a detective who had spent years navigating the labyrinth of human deception. The town, with its quiet desperation and the weight of its own history, had become her new battlefield. She began her investigation by visiting the old mill, the first site of the murder, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the lingering traces of blood. The body had been removed, but the ground still bore the marks of the violence that had taken place there. She knelt, running her fingers over the soil, searching for any sign that might lead her to the killer's identity. She knew that the key to solving the mystery lay in the town's past, in the forgotten records that had been buried beneath layers of silence and denial. The first place she turned was the courthouse, its once proud facade, now a monument to the town's reluctance to confront its own history. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of aged paper and the faint, acrid tang of candle smoke. She found the record she was looking for in the archives, a collection of documents that had been long neglected, their pages yellowed with time. Among them was a file on the original case that had haunted Blackmoor for decades, a case that had never been properly closed. The file was incomplete, its details fragmented and obscured by the passage of time. But as Clara sifted through the pages, she found a name that sent a chill through her: Thomas Vane, her brother. His name had been linked to the case in ways she had never fully understood, but now, with the recent murders, the connection became undeniable. He had been involved, but not as a victim. He had been a witness, a man who had seen something that had changed the course of his life forever. As she pieced together the fragments of the past, she realized that the killer was not acting on a whim, nor was their vengeance driven by a single act of injustice. The murders were part of a larger pattern, a retribution that had been waiting for the right moment to unfold. The killer had been waiting for the right moment to unfold. The killer had been watching, waiting, and now, with each passing day, the town was being drawn deeper into the web of their vengeance. Clara knew that she was running out of time. The next victim would not be far, and if, not as a victim, he had been waiting for the right moment to unfold. She was to stop the killer. She had to move quickly. She left the courthouse with a renewed sense of urgency, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. The town was no longer just a place of quiet decay, it was a battleground, and she was the only one who could see the truth hidden beneath its surface. The town's fractured trust, the fear that had taken root in Blackmoor, was no longer confined to the shadows. It had seeped into the very fabric of the town, unraveling the fragile threads of trust that had once bound its people together. Conversations that had once bound its people together. Conversations that had once been lighthearted now carried an undercurrent of suspicion, and even the most mundane interactions were laced with what had taken root in Blackmoor was no longer Confronts himself at the center of a growing storm, his every word scrutinized by a town that had lost faith in its own institutions. The local clergyman, who had once offered comfort in times of hardship, now found himself the subject of whispered accusations. His sermons met with wary glances and hushed debates. The murders had not only shaken the town's sense of security, but had also reignited old grudges that had long been buried. Neighbors, who had once shared the same streets without hesitation, now avoided one another, their eyes darting away whenever they caught sight of a familiar face. The tavern, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, had become a haven for hushed conversations and wary glances. Even the children, who had once played freely in the town square, now moved with a cautious awareness, their games interrupted by the fear. Now found himself moo! That had taken hold of the adults around them. Clara could see it in the way people moved, how their steps quickened when they passed certain streets, how they looked over their shoulders as if expecting to see the killer lurking in the shadows. The town was no longer a place of quiet resilience, but a place of fear, where every whispered rumor carried the weight of possibility. And with each passing day, that fear grew, feeding the growing paranoia that had taken hold of Blackmoor. The killer had not only struck fear into the hearts of the townspeople, but had also turned them against one another. The once stable community was now a place of suspicion, where every glance was a potential accusation and every conversation a possible betrayal. The mayor, desperate to restore order, had called for a meeting, but the townspeople had not come with the hope of unity. They had come with questions, with demands, and with the unshakable belief that someone among them was responsible for the murders. And in the midst of it all, Clara stood as the only one who had begun to see the truth hidden beneath the surface, even as the town itself was being consumed by the very fear it had once sought to suppress, the confrontation in the shadows. Clara stood at the threshold of the old mill, her breath shallow as she listened to the wind howl through the broken windows. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something more elusive, more dangerous. She had followed the trail of evidence to this place, her mind racing with the implications of what she had uncovered. The killer was close, and she knew that the next step would be the most dangerous. She had spent the last few days piecing together the fragments of the past, uncovering the truth that had been buried beneath layers of silence and denial. The killer was not acting out of malice, nor was their vengeance driven by a single act of injustice. They had been waiting for this moment, for the time when the town's sins would be forced into the light. And now, with the murders that had begun to shake Blackmoor to its core, they had finally acted. Clara stepped forward, her boots crunching against the loose gravel that littered the ground. The mill had long since fallen into disrepair, its once proud structure now a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The walls were lined with cracks, and the faint scent of decay clung to the air. She could almost hear the echoes of the past in the silence that surrounded her, the whispers of those who had once walked these halls. Then, a voice, low, measured, and filled with an unshakable certainty. "You've come a long way, Clara." She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness for the source of the voice. The figure emerged from the shadows, their silhouette outlined against the dim light that filtered through the broken windows. They were tall, their presence commanding, their face obscured by the shadows that clung to them like a second skin. "I know who you are," Clara said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "You've been watching this town for years, waiting for the right moment to act. But this isn't justice, this is revenge." The figure stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with the cold fire of someone who had long since made their decision. "Justice," they said, their voice low and measured. "That's what you think this is? That's what you want to believe? You think the law was ever truly just? That the people who did the things they did were ever held accountable?" Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent years chasing the truth, fighting against the corruption that had so often left the guilty untouched. But this was different. This was not just another case of injustice, it was personal. "You think you're the only one who suffered," she said, taking a step closer. "But you're not. I've seen what you've done. I've seen the fear you've sown. And I won't let you continue." The figure tilted their head, a slow, almost amused smile playing at the corners of their lips. "Then stop me!" Clara's fingers curled into fists. She had come too far to turn back now. The confrontation was inevitable, and the time for words had passed. The reckoning in the shadows. The air was thick with tension as Clara and the figure stood face to face, the weight of the past pressing down upon them like a storm on the verge of breaking. The mill, once a place of industry and purpose, had become a prison of secrets, its walls echoing with the voices of those who had long since vanished. The killer's presence was undeniable, their every movement deliberate, their voice carrying the weight of years spent waiting for this moment. "You think you can stop me," the figure said, their voice low and measured, each word a blade cutting through the silence. "You think you can undo what has already been done?" Clara's grip tightened on the small knife she had concealed in her pocket, the weight of the moment pressing against her. She had spent years chasing justice, but this was not a case of corruption or cover-ups. This was something else, something deeper, something that had been buried for far too long. "I didn't come here to stop you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest. "I came here to understand, to see what you were trying to do." "But this isn't justice, this is vengeance, and it's not justice, this is vengeance, and it's not just destroying the people who did the wrong things. It's think you can undo what has stopped you something that had been buried for far too long." "I didn't come here to stop you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest. "The town itself." The figure stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with the fire of someone who had long since made their decision. "You think I care about the town? You think I care about the people who stood by and watched as the truth was buried?" They laughed, a sound that was more like a whisper than a real voice. "I don't care about the town. I care about the people who were wronged, the people who were silenced. I care about the truth, and I will not let it be buried again." Clara took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "You think you're bringing justice to the town, but all you're doing is creating more pain? You're not the only one who suffered. You think you're the only one who's been wronged?" The figure's expression hardened, their eyes narrowing. "I was wronged. I watched as the people who should have been held accountable walked free. I watched as the truth was buried beneath layers of silence and denial, and I will not let that happen again." Clara's breath came fast and shallow. She had spent years chasing the truth, but she had never expected to stand face to face with someone who had been shaped by the same pain that had driven her. She had always believed that justice was something that had to be pursued, that it was something that could be found if you searched hard enough. But now, standing in the shadows of the old mill, she was beginning to see the truth in a way she never had before. "You think you're the only one who suffered?" she asked again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "But you're not. I've spent years trying to find the truth, to bring justice to the people who were wronged. I've seen what happens when the law fails. I've seen what happens when people are left to rot in silence." The figure's expression faltered for the briefest moment, their eyes flickering with something that looked almost like regret. But then the fire returned, and they stepped forward, their voice a whisper of something that had long since been buried. "Then let the truth come out. Let the world see what was done. Let the people who were wronged be remembered." Clara looked at them, her heart aching with the weight of everything they had said. She had spent years chasing justice, to bring justice to the people who were wronged. The standing in the presence of someone, the stepped forward, their voice a whisper of something that had long since been buried. "Then you, nah," who had been shaped by the same pain. She realized that the truth was not always something that could be pursued. Sometimes it was something that had to be unearthed, no matter the cost. And as the wind howled through the broken windows of the mill, she knew that the final confrontation was about to begin. The weight of justice. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the unspoken understanding that neither Clara nor the figure before her could turn back now. The mill, once a place of industry and purpose, had become the crucible in which the truth would be forced into the light. Clara knew that what came next would not be easy. There was no way to undo the damage that had already been done, no way to erase the fear that had taken root in Blackmoor. But she also knew that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only path forward. The figure, their face still partially obscured by the shadows, took a slow step back, their expression unreadable. For a moment, Clara thought they might turn and disappear into the night, leaving the town to its own reckoning. But then, with a deep breath, they reached into the folds of their coat and pulled out a small, weathered file. The leather was cracked with age, the edges worn from years of being hidden away. Clara's heart pounded as she recognized the insignia on the cover, the same one that had marked the old case that had haunted Blackmoor for so long. "You were right," the figure said, their voice low but steady. "I was wronged, but I was also wrong too. Believe that vengeance was the only path forward. I thought that by taking lives I could force the truth into the light, but I was wrong." Clara stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the file in the figure's hands. "Then what do you want now?" The figure hesitated, their fingers tightening around the file as if it were a lifeline. I want the truth to be known, not just for the people who were wronged, but for the town itself. I want the people who were responsible to face what they did. I want the past to be acknowledged, not buried again. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She'd spent years chasing the truth, believing that justice could be found in the pursuit of it. But now, standing before the figure who had spent years waiting, for the same moment she saw that the truth was not just about punishment, it was about reckoning. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the file as if she could feel the weight of the past pressing against her. "Then let's do it." The figure nodded slowly, their expressions softening for the first time. "It won't be easy. There are still people who don't want the truth to come out. But if we do this, if we bring it to light, then maybe the town can finally move forward." Clara looked around at the crumbling walls of the mill, the shadows that had once hidden the past now standing in the light of what was to come. She had come to Blackmoor to solve a mystery, to find the truth behind the murders that had shaken the Scrobus town to its core. But now she realized that the real mystery had always been the one that had been buried in the town's history. And as she and the figure stood together in the flickering light of the old mill, she knew that the final chapter of their story had only just begun. The echoes of justice and revenge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruins of the old mill, the weight of what had transpired settled over Blackmoor like a heavy mist. The town, once a place of quiet decay and buried secrets, had been forced to confront the truth that had long been hidden in its past. The murders had not been random acts of vengeance, nor had they been the work of a lone killer seeking retribution. They had been a reckoning, a final attempt to bring the truth into the light after years of silence and denial. Clara stood at the threshold of the mill, her heart still pounding with the echoes of the confrontation that had taken place. She had come to Blackmoor seeking justice, believing that the law would deliver it in the end. But now, she understood that justice was not always found in the courtroom or the archives of the past. Sometimes it was forced into the light by those who had suffered in silence, by those who had waited for the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. The figure who had stood before her, the one who had sought vengeance in the name of justice, had not been the villain she had once believed them to be. They had been a part of the town's history, shaped by the same pain and betrayal that had driven Clara to seek the truth, and in the end, they had chosen not to destroy, but to reveal. The file they had carried, the one that had been hidden for so long, would be the key to the town's reckoning. But as Clara looked out over the town, she knew that the work was far from over. The people of Blackmoor would have to face the past, to confront the sins that had been buried beneath layers of silence and denial. Justice, she had learned, was not a simple thing. It was not always found in punishment or retribution. Sometimes it was found in the willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And as the wind howled through the broken windows of the mill, she knew that the story of Blackmoor was far from over. The echoes of justice and revenge would continue to shape the town for years to come, a reminder that the past was never truly buried and that the weight of history could never be forgotten. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.